U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos.
The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term.
Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA.
Power politics rarely show themselves this clearly. 5 demands arrived from Washington, each one aimed straight at Canada's economy, culture, and sovereignty. Most leaders would have tried to soften the edges or quietly compromise behind closed doors. Mark Carney did something else entirely. He rejected all 5 publicly and without hesitation. That single decision set off a chain reaction across North America, exposing how deeply the United States depends on Canada and how prepared Ottawa had become for this moment. What followed was not a shouting match. It became a strategic standoff with global consequences. The United States laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions that the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term. The United States has tied those conditions to lifting punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, alcohol, dairy, and energy. All of them were placed on the table as part of the pressure campaign surrounding the future of the three-way trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, known as CUSMA. President of the United States, Donald Trump, placed 5 demands on the table as conditions for extending North America's most important trade agreement: dairy access, digital media laws, provincial alcohol restrictions, government procurement rules, energy policy. Each demand targeted a specific pillar of Canada's economy, and together they formed a blueprint for reshaping the entire trading relationship between the two countries. Mark Carney reviewed the list and rejected every single item. That response was not emotional and it was not impulsive. It was calculated, because behind each demand sat a quiet admission about what Washington needed most. United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer laid everything out before Congress. No leaks and no speculation. The message was direct. Canada must comply if it wants the agreement extended another 16 years. The first demand centered on dairy. American producers want broader access to Canada's tightly controlled dairy market. Under the current system, U.S. farmers can export limited volumes tariff-free. Anything above that threshold faces tariffs ranging from 200 to 298%. Greer described Canada's supply management system as unfair and claimed it blocks American farmers from competing on equal footing. Carney responded the following day. Supply management was not up for discussion. He delivered that answer in French, signaling directly to Quebec, where dairy farming supports thousands of families and where the system carries enormous political weight. Canada reinforced that position weeks earlier by passing legislation that permanently protects supply management. This was not a temporary promise. It became law. Even if Ottawa wanted to bend it, no longer could. Washington could demand changes, but the door was legally closed. The second demand targeted digital media. Canada's Online Streaming Act requires platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube to invest a share of their Canadian revenue into local content. The Online News Act forces large platforms to compensate Canadian publishers when they link or republish news stories. Greer argued that both laws discriminate against American tech companies and create barriers for U.S. digital service providers. Canada's position remained firm. These laws exist to protect Canadian culture, journalism, and creative industries. Without them, American platforms would dominate the market entirely, leaving local voices buried beneath global algorithms. Carney made it clear that cultural sovereignty was not a bargaining chip. Dismantling these protections would hand control of Canada's media landscape directly to Silicon Valley. That trade-off was never going to happen. The third demand focused on alcohol. Several Canadian provinces, including Ontario and British Columbia, banned American beer and wine in response to President of the United States Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. Greer demanded those bans be lifted as part of the trade extension. What Washington overlooked was the sequence of events. The bans came after the tariffs. Remove the tariffs, and the provincial bans disappear. Greer instead asked Canada to lift its retaliation while U.S. tariffs remained in place. That proposal required Canada to accept economic punishment without defending itself. Carney refused. The bans would stay until the tariffs came down. The fourth demand involved government procurement. Greer accused Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia of favoring Canadian suppliers over American companies for public contracts. He called these practices discriminatory and demanded changes. The argument rang hollow. The United States enforces Buy American policies across federal agencies and military contracts. Domestic preference rules apply to everything from steel to software. Washington was asking Canada to abandon policies that America uses every day. Carney treated the request as what it was: hypocrisy presented as negotiation. The fifth demand centered on energy. Greer raised concerns about Alberta's electricity grid, claiming it favored in-province generation over imports from Montana during certain periods. Alberta's utilities minister rejected the allegation outright and stated there was no differential treatment. But the larger energy reality ran in the opposite direction. The United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every day. About 23% of American refinery feedstock comes from Canada. Gulf Coast refineries were designed specifically to process Canadian heavy sour crude. During winter peaks, New England relies on Canadian electricity to keep homes heated and lights on. Energy does not flow in one direction. Canada supplies a massive share of what keeps America running. This is where most commentary misses the point. Many assumed that rejecting 5 demands weakens Canada's position or invites retaliation. But Carney was not issuing blind refusals. He was holding leverage. Each demand revealed pressure points inside the American economy. Dairy access showed that US farmers need Canadian consumers. Digital media complaints showed that American tech firms are losing billions due to Canada's local investment rules. Procurement demands showed that Canadian governments are successfully keeping money at home. Every item on Greer's list highlighted a Canadian policy that works. Instead of weakening Canada, the demands exposed its strengths, and one sector remained conspicuously absent from the list: automobiles. That silence said everything. North America's auto industry operates as a single integrated system. Parts cross the border multiple times before a vehicle reaches the showroom floor. Canadian factories produce components for American trucks. US plants manufacture engines for Canadian sedans. The entire supply chain depends on seamless movement between countries. Automakers told Congress that the trade agreement saves tens of billions of dollars each year through regional integration. Mark Roos, president of General Motors, explained that supply chains span all 3 countries and that the complexity is enormous. President of the United States, Donald Trump, imposed Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos, disrupting the very network American manufacturers rely on. Now, those same manufacturers are urging Washington to preserve the agreement. Without it, tariffs become permanent and integrated production begins to fracture. Carney understands this dynamic. The auto industry represents Canada's quiet leverage, because if the agreement collapses, American manufacturers suffer first. Then came Carney's move toward China. He traveled to Beijing and negotiated what he described as friendly nation tariffs, meaning targeted relief on canola, electric vehicles, and agricultural exports. This was not a free trade agreement. It removed specific barriers that had been hurting Canadian farmers. President of the United States, Donald Trump, initially praised the effort, then reversed himself days later and threatened 100% tariffs if Canada became what he called a drop-off port for China. Carney clarified immediately. Canada was not pursuing a free trade agreement with China. The arrangement did not violate the existing trade deal and did not trigger the China clause that allows the United States to terminate it. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc confirmed the details of the China agreement directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, who acknowledged the explanation. But the impact of that deal goes far beyond canola. It sends a clear message. Canada has options. Diversifying trade reduces dependence on Washington and strengthens Ottawa's negotiating leverage ahead of a potential agreement review in July. 3 paths now remain: a 16-year extension, withdrawal by either side, or annual rolling reviews through 2036. For decades, nearly 75% of Canadian exports flowed to the United States, leaving Ottawa exposed to pressure. That reality is shifting. Agricultural access to China is expanding. European ties are deepening. A Buy Canadian policy is redirecting roughly $70 billion toward domestic suppliers. And Canada's critical minerals have become essential to US clean energy and artificial intelligence ambitions. If annual reviews begin, uncertainty would hit both sides of the border. Nearly 150 US industry leaders, from autos to energy to agriculture, have urged Congress to maintain the agreement. Despite political rhetoric calling the deal irrelevant, US exports to Canada and Mexico have risen sharply under it. While Washington escalates demands, Ottawa has quietly built alternatives. By July, Canada enters negotiations with diversified trade routes, aligned provincial strategies, and greater economic resilience than at any point in decades, signaling that leverage in North America no longer flows in just one direction.